In our last session, we learnt about a man called Abram. God later renamed him Abraham. He lived in a city called Ur. It was probably located in what is now southern Iraq. God said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." God was going to lead Abram to another land. God didn't say where this land was, but Abram trusted God. He obeyed God and set off, not knowing where God was going to lead him. Abram and his household travelled to a town called Haran. There they stayed for a while. Then God led Abram and his household to the land of Canaan. This is roughly what is now the country of Israel. This was the land that God was going to give to Abram's descendants. In time, Abram made his base near a town called Hebron. He settled by some trees called the Great Trees of Mamre. The tree you can see here is said to be one of those trees. Abram and his household lived in tents, rather like these Bedouin Arabs in this early photograph. But Abram and his wife Sarai were growing older. They were still childless. They longed for a child. God had promised Abram a multitude of descendants. How was that going to happen? One night God said to Abram, "Look up at the sky and count the stars." Then God assured Abram that his descendants would be as countless as the stars in the sky. Abram believed God. He trusted that God would do what he said, however impossible it might seem. So God considered Abram, sinful man though he was, to be righteous, in other words, to be in right relationship with him. God told Abram to sacrifice some animals and birds. Abram cut the animals in half, then he laid the pieces, together with the birds, in 2 rows. Why did he do this? As we've already seen, God had made promises to Abram. Now God guaranteed that Abram's descendants would indeed possess the promised land. God did this by making a binding agreement, in other words, a covenant with Abram. This sacrificial ceremony would seal that covenant. In those days, a king might make a covenant, in other words, a binding agreement, with another king. When they did this, they would also offer a sacrifice. If one of the kings was more powerful, the less powerful king might have to walk between the pieces of the sacrificial animal. This was a symbolic act. It meant that if he ever broke the covenant with the more powerful king, he would have to share the fate of the sacrificial animal. He would have to suffer the penalty of death. Abram was the junior partner in this covenant with God. He should have walked between the sacrifices, but instead God walked between them. God made his presence visible as a smoking pot and a blazing torch. Why did God do this? It seems quite possible that he was saying, in effect, if this covenant is ever broken, I myself will suffer the penalty of death. God's covenant with his people would indeed be broken, but it wouldn't be God who broke it. Abram's descendants broke it. They should have suffered the penalty of death. But, as we'll see later on our journey, the Son of God himself, Jesus Christ, paid that penalty for them. He died in their place. But Abram sometimes failed to trust God. On one occasion his wife persuaded him to take her servant girl Hagar as another wife. Hagar bore Abram a son called Ishmael. But all this was a terrible mistake. Abraham was trying to fulfill God's promises using his own human methods, so it ended in failure. Years later, God appeared to Abraham again. He was now 99 years old. God promised him that he would be the father of a multitude of nations and that kings would come from him. God promised that Sarai would bear him a son. Abraham was to call him Isaac. God also gave Abraham and Sarai new names, Abraham and Sarah. And God promised Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan as a possession forever. Then God commanded Abraham, together with the men and boys and baby boys who were 8 days old or over, to be circumcised. Jews still practice circumcision today. This photograph shows a baby being circumcised. Circumcision was symbolic. It symbolized the covenant that God made with Abraham. We can explain it like this. A wedding ring shows that someone is in a special relationship with their husband or wife. In the same kind of way, circumcision showed that Abraham and his household were in a special relationship, in their case with God himself. But why did God choose circumcision to be this symbol? One reason may be this. All the things that God had promised Abraham, fathering many nations, possessing the land, and being a blessing to the world, depended on just one thing. They depended on Abraham having a son by his wife Sarah. Circumcision is performed on the part of a man's body that's involved in procreation. God's promise of a son and his other promises wouldn't be fulfilled by natural human virility or strength. They'd be fulfilled only by God's miraculous power. All the males in Abraham's household were circumcised. Abraham's household included not only his relatives, but also people who weren't related to him. They were all members of God's covenant people. God has always wanted people from every tribe and nation to be in relationship with him. But God didn't want his covenant people only to be physically circumcised. He wanted them to have circumcised ears and hearts too. In other words, ears that listened to him, and hearts that loved and trusted and obeyed him. At last, Sarah gave birth to the promised son. His name was Isaac. When Isaac was a young lad, God said to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." To sacrifice his dearly loved son Isaac was the greatest sacrifice Abraham could ever make. But without delay he obeyed. In this painting, Abraham is about to kill his son. An angel, seen on the left, stops him. At the last minute, God provided a male sheep to take Isaac's place. You can see it on the right of this painting. Abraham offered this sheep instead of his precious son. God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on a mountain in the land of Moriah. This mountain may well be Mount Moriah, one of the hills that the city of Jerusalem was later built on. Here's an old photograph of Jerusalem. If this is correct, then Abraham offered his son close to the place where Jesus Christ was one day going to be crucified. Abraham's sacrifice of his only son is a prophecy. It looks forward to the sacrifice of God's only son on the cross. God confirmed to Isaac the promises that he'd made to his father Abraham. Isaac's wife Rebekah gave birth to 2 boys, twins, Esau and Jacob. As the firstborn, Esau would have succeeded Isaac as the head of the family. But one day Esau came home ravenously hungry. Jacob, the crafty man that he was, did a deal with him. He gave Esau a meal in return for Esau's privileges as the firstborn son. Years later, the time came for Isaac to bless his sons. By then, old Isaac couldn't see. Crafty Jacob took advantage. He pretended to be Esau, and so Isaac gave the firstborn's blessing to Jacob instead of Esau. Esau decided to wait till his father Isaac died and then kill Jacob. So Isaac sent Jacob off to Uncle Laban, who lived hundreds of miles away. There he would be safe. On the way, Jacob had a dream. In that dream, God confirmed to him the promises he'd made to Abraham and Isaac. God also told him, "I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land." Jacob worshipped God and made a vow to him. But God still had lots of work to do in this enterprising and self-reliant man. For 20 years, Jacob served Uncle Laban by looking after his sheep and goats. It was a tough life, but God enabled Jacob to prosper. Then Jacob and his family returned to Canaan. On the way, God met him again. God appeared in the form of a man and wrestled with him. In the struggle, God crippled Jacob. Jacob walked away from that struggle limping. But God also blessed him, and he gave him a new name, Israel, meaning you have struggled with God. Jacob emerged from that struggle with God a changed man. God had humbled him. Jacob's self-sufficiency and resourcefulness was broken. Now he depended on God. Jacob had 12 sons. They were the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's favourite son was Joseph. In his youth, Joseph seemed rather arrogant. He had 2 dreams in which he saw himself ruling over his family. He told his brothers about these dreams. Tired of all this, his brothers sold him off to some travelling merchants as a slave. Joseph ended up in Egypt, quite possibly in the location marked on this map. Joseph served in the household of one of the Egyptian king's officers, called Potiphar. God blessed Joseph there, and eventually he became Potiphar's chief servant. But Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. Then she falsely accused Joseph of trying to seduce her. So Potiphar put Joseph in prison. God blessed Joseph in prison too, and he rose to a position of responsibility there. One day, the Egyptian king, called the Pharaoh, asked Joseph to interpret 2 dreams he'd had. God revealed to Joseph what these dreams meant. Egypt would enjoy 7 years of good harvests, but then there would be 7 years of crop failure. Joseph advised Pharaoh what to do. He said that Pharaoh should store up grain in the plentiful years and use it to feed the nation during the years of crop failure. Pharaoh appointed Joseph himself to be his chief minister. During the years of good harvests, Joseph arranged for part of Egypt's crops to be stored. This is a model of an ancient Egyptian grain store. It was made around 4,000 years ago, before Joseph was even born. The crops that Joseph had stored up fed the nation during the years of crop failure. Joseph's brothers too came from Canaan to buy food in Egypt. They didn't know that Joseph was now the country's chief minister. Eventually, Joseph revealed who he was to his brothers. He forgave them for selling him into slavery. Joseph's family came to live in Egypt. Pharaoh gave them the best land to settle in. Joseph is a picture of Jesus. Joseph was rejected by his family. Jesus was rejected by his own nation. Joseph saved people from starvation. Jesus saves people from spiritual death, that is, from being cut off from relationship with God forever. Before he died, Jacob prophesied over his 12 sons. Over his son Judah, he said, "The royal scepter will not leave Judah until he comes to whom the scepter belongs, and the nations will obey him." This prophecy was about a king. He would be a descendant of Judah. Ultimately, this prophecy was fulfilled by Jesus. He would be that coming king. He would rule the world. This is a key prophecy about Jesus. In fact, we learn more and more about Jesus as we travel through the Old Testament. God blessed the Israelites in Egypt. The Bible tells us the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Many years after Joseph died, another Pharaoh ruled Egypt. This Pharaoh was afraid that the Israelites might join forces with Egypt's enemies. So he used them as forced labour, first for building projects, then for even harder work, making bricks and mortar and working in the fields. So God set in motion a plan to rescue his people. For this great task, he chose a man called Moses. To control the Israelites' population, Pharaoh commanded that all newborn Israelite boys must be killed. One Israelite couple tried to save their baby son. They put him in a basket and placed him among the reeds on the riverbank. The baby was found by none other than Pharaoh's daughter, a scene captured in this painting. She adopted him as her son. She named him Moses. Moses was now Pharaoh's adopted grandson. In the book of Acts, we read that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. But one day, when he was 40 years old, Moses had to flee from Egypt. He had killed an Egyptian slave master who was beating an Israelite. Pharaoh was now after his blood. Moses fled eastwards to the Sinai Peninsula, or beyond to northwestern Arabia. There he married and spent 40 years looking after sheep in the desert. This was God's appointed training ground for Moses. One day he would lead God's people through the desert. Sheep need constant care and attention. God's people would need constant care and attention too. When Moses was 80 years old, God appeared to him. He appeared as a blazing fire in a bush. God commissioned Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. God told Moses to tell Israel that his name was I Am. Through this name, God revealed himself as the living God, the God who was with his people, the God who was caring for his people. We might translate this name as, I am he who is for you. The Israelites could rely on God. So can we. This name, I Am, is a form of one of God's names, Yahweh. Yahweh is God's personal name. It's the most frequently used name for God in the Old Testament. So Moses returned to Egypt. he and his brother Aaron told the Israelite leaders about God's plan to rescue them. But things got even worse. The Egyptians made the Israelites work even harder at making bricks. So God sent 10 plagues on the Egyptians, for example, plagues of frogs, flies, hail, and locusts. This image shows a swarm of locusts. Through these plagues, God was showing the Egyptians that he, and not their pagan gods, was Lord. But Pharaoh was obstinate, so God unleashed the last and most terrible plague. All the firstborn sons in Egypt would die. Before this plague, God told Moses that the Israelites had to eat a special meal. It was called the Passover meal. Each family had to kill a lamb or a goat, then smear some of its blood on the doorframe of their house. They had to roast the whole animal and eat it as part of a meal. They were to eat this meal quickly, ready to leave Egypt. Why did they have to eat this meal? The key reason seems to be this. In those days, people would eat together only if they were in relationship with each other, if they were in the same family, or if they were friends or allies. So when people made a covenant, in other words, a binding agreement, they would typically share a meal together. This was a sign that they were in covenant relationship with each other. This Passover meal was a sign that the Israelites were in covenant relationship with God. They were God's special people. The Passover meal was to be followed by 7 days when they didn't eat anything made with yeast. We'll explain why in our next session. Every family that believed God and obeyed him by following his instructions and eating the Passover meal was spared. Their firstborn sons didn't die. God's destroyer passed them by. They didn't die because the Passover lamb died instead. But all the Egyptians' firstborn sons died, even Pharaoh's own firstborn son. In this painting, Pharaoh sits in silent grief, his dead firstborn son lying on his lap. The mother weeps over her son's body. The Passover meal points forward to Jesus. He is our Passover lamb. The Passover lambs died instead of the firstborn sons. Jesus died instead of us. Jesus died to save us from death, that is, from being separated from God forever. And he released us from slavery, not from slavery to human masters, but from slavery to sin. We'll look at this more later on our journey. So at last Pharaoh sent God's people out of Egypt. They abandoned their homes and left. A motley assortment of other people went with them too. God led them to the Sea of Reeds. The arrow shows where it was probably located. This painting shows the people by the sea. God made his presence visible to his people as a pillar of cloud and fire. You can see this pillar on the right of this painting. But suddenly Pharaoh changed his mind. He and his army chased after the Israelites. But God's pillar of cloud and fire came between the Egyptians and God's people. Then God divided the Sea of Reeds. His people walked over the dry seabed to the Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptian army chased them, but the waters returned and drowned them. God's people were free at last. They sang for joy. God led his people to Mount Sinai. He made a covenant with them there. And he came to live among them in a tent called the tabernacle. We'll look at all this in our next session.